Talofa lava, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Susanna Suisuiki. Coming up, a new tropical cyclone formed nearby Vanuatu. Also,
the motion put forward isn't anything new. This would be the second time this has happened in the last 42 years.
Samoa's Prime Minister defeats the motion of no confidence, and Pope Francis's health remains critical. A new tropical cyclone to the east of Vanuatu has intensified and been named Seru. Cyclone forecasters at the Fiji Met Service have confirmed to RNZ Pacific that the system is expected to intensify into a Category 2 overnight. Meanwhile, Tonga Met Service still have active warnings for Cyclone Ray, which is still a Category 2 system in place for their southern islands. I spoke with meteorologist from NIWA, Seth Carrier, and began by asking him if it's unusual for multiple tropical cyclones to develop at this time of the year.
Well, not necessarily, at least not all the time. This time of the year, February, is really oftentimes the peak of tropical cyclone season in the Southwest Pacific. We're now at the tail end of summer, and there's been several months for the water temperatures to warm up, and warm water temperatures are one of the real main factors that you need to cause a tropical cyclone. So the end of the summer is actually a really good time. Now, I think one of the main reasons why we're suddenly seeing 3 tropical cyclones forming right around the same time is because there's this thing called the SPCZ, or the South Pacific Convergence Zone. And that's actually been fairly strong recently, and it's also located further south than it usually is. So the SPCZ is actually just to the north of Vanuatu towards Fiji, and it was near the Samoan Islands recently. And that has actually allowed these tropical cyclones to form, and it's been one of the driving factors for why we have these 3 cyclones forming in a very short succession.
Can we expect more cyclones or other severe weather events?
Well, I certainly think that it's possible we'll see additional cyclones going forward. Don't forget that the tropical cyclone season continues until the end of April, so we still have about 2 more months to go. Now, I think once we get through these current cyclones that we're dealing with, we may have a little bit of a lull as we go into early and mid-March. However, I wouldn't be surprised as we get into late March and April for there to be a better chance for more cyclones to form. But I don't expect that we're going to be seeing multiple cyclones at all times over the next several weeks. I think that what we're seeing now is a little bit of an outlier.
You just touched on this briefly in my first question, but could you explain why Pacific islands such as Vanuatu or Fiji, why are they more at risk with cyclones?
Well, it can depend on It changes year by year. It's not always the same island groups that have the highest chance of cyclones. But for this season, a lot of the low pressure that we're seeing, it's been the Southwest Pacific, places around Fiji, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, the Coral Sea. All of those areas have been pretty conducive for low pressure development. Now, some of the time, it's just regular garden variety low pressure. But at other times, it's allowed these tropical cyclones to form. So it just so happens that this particular season, the Southwest Pacific and areas closer to Australia have been the best area for tropical cyclones. But that's not necessarily the case every summer.
Seth, with climate change being the single biggest threat to the Pacific region, will we see more cyclones even outside of the cyclone season?
I do think that as we see more climate change, it is possible that tropical cyclones could become a little bit more frequent outside of the traditional, time period of the tropical cyclone season. And again, tropical cyclone season for the Southwest Pacific goes through the end of April. But it doesn't, by definition, mean that there's no chance of a tropical cyclone after that point. So I do think that with warmer ocean temperatures that are likely to occur with climate change, it is possible that the tropical cyclone season could maybe continue on a bit later, at least some of the time, as we go into the future.
For the latest updates, head over to our website at rnz.co.nz/Pacific. Samoan Prime Minister Fiame Naomi Mataafa has survived a vote of no confidence after weeks of political turmoil. She defeated the motion by 34 votes in favour and 15 against. The motion was prompted by splits in the ruling Fast Party, which resulted in Fiame being forced to lead a minority government. Grace Fever-Ai has more.
5 members of the Human Rights Protection Party were selected to address the motion today. They included opposition leader Tuila Epa Sailele Malielengaoi, Fonotoila Wofo Pierre, Whaimalota Kika Stowers, Lea Ana Roni Borsini, and Lea Leile Pule Rimoni Ayafi. In his address, Tuila Epa said Parliament should be resolved and that this isn't the first time something like this has happened.
The motion put forward isn't anything new. This would be the second time this has happened in the last 42 years. First in 1982 under Tupuola Effie's time, when HRPP won and governed. It's not new. And it happened again in 1985. They've gone from fast party to fast government. Parliament should be dissolved. We're heading in the same way as other governments, like America.
Meanwhile, Laoli, who leads the main fast grouping with 20 members, expressed sadness over the events of the day.
This morning is not a morning that is easy. It is embarrassing. We are questioning now about authority, but there is only authority which is given by God that Samoa is founded on. I feel sad because we are now questioning what Samoa has decided for those to govern. The 3 bills need to be passed, which is what we should do first. Instead, we are here this morning pointing fingers. If we dissolve Parliament, what will Samoa have?
In his response, Tuila Epa called Laoli and his MPs two-faced for changing their tune on Fiame's leadership. Fiame addressed her faction and ministers, offering reassurances and encouraging them to let the process unfold while invoking a biblical quote for comfort. However, she remained firm on her main point that her minority government was legitimate given no one has majority support in the House.
This game of politics is based on numbers. I believe that there are 18 members from the opposition, 20 from NIWA Maunga, 3 and 15 from the candidate. These numbers are far from the needed 27, including yourself. My 15 is combined, covered by the laws to rule the government. There is nothing important in the motion because there is no governance, whether or not these can be changed.
When it came time to vote, fast members who have been unhappy with Fiame surprisingly voted, alongside the Prime Minister and her faction, defeating opposition leader Tuila Epa Sailele Malielengaoi's motion convincingly by 34 votes to 15. The Human Rights Protection Party actually has 18 members, but 2 MPs Lautafi Seilafi Purcell and Salah Fatapinati were absent, and Maulolo Tavita Amosa opted to abstain from today's vote. Samoa's parliamentary meeting is set to reconvene tomorrow at 9:30.
Zone of peace or ocean of discontent? That is the question that was posed to dozens of academics, politicians, researchers and political experts from all over the Pacific who gathered last week in Wellington. Organised by Te Herenga Waka Victoria University of Wellington, the largest Pacific politics-focused conference in New Zealand looked at the pressure being placed on the international order of the last 80 years and the internal political pressures in many Pacific nations. Koroi Hawkins went along to some of the sessions and filed this report.
New Zealand's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Winston Peters, set the tone for discussions in his opening speech on Wednesday.
Our region is faced with the sharpest strategic competition it has confronted since World War II.
Recent diplomatic spats with Kiribati over access to President Tanis Maumau and with the Cook Islands Prime Minister Mark Brown refusing to disclose beforehand the details of agreements he's now signed with China have marred an unprecedented push by Mr. Peters to visit and consult with Pacific leaders over the past year. Mr. Peters says he's committed to resolving these differences and says the Pacific must remain united.
As we face external pushes into our region to coerce, cajole and constrain, we must stand together as a region, always remembering that we are strongest when we act collectively to confront security and strategic challenges.
Transform Angarau, the Vice-Chancellor of Solomon Islands National University, was the conference's keynote speaker. Mr. Angarao posed an alternative to the conference theme, saying the Pacific should be seen as an ocean of possibility. He said Pacific peoples have had to contend with foreign influence since the time of the European explorers and missionaries, and the only difference today is they are better equipped intellectually to face the pressure.
And I think we are a region that have more in common than actually separate us. Notwithstanding our characterization as Polynesians, Melanesians and Micronesians, we occupy the largest aquatic continent in the world, and therefore our lives are intertwined by it, and we are enjoined by it, and therefore we are strengthened by it, not weakened by it.
Kiribati's first woman opposition leader, Tessie Lambourne, was her country's ambassador to Taiwan when Tarawa ditched Taipei for Beijing. She's skeptical of China's intentions for her country and has been urging President Tanis Maumau to fight to keep Kiribati's interests ahead of the superpowers. As an example, she recounted an incident in 2022 when the Kiribati government broke its own strict COVID-19 lockdown restrictions to accommodate a visit by China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi.
Kiribati had initially said that it would not be possible because he would be required to stay in quarantine for 2 weeks. But in the end, he was allowed to come in, breach all our quarantine laws, in quarantine. Came straight from the plane, met with our president, our vice president, ministers and officials of government. 4 hours and then he left. And then the people he met, including our president, vice president, they went into quarantine.
A panelist at the conference, Kanak academic Anthony Tugoro, is involved in a project to survey potential future political frameworks for New Caledonia. He says for years New Caledonians have been presented with only two options, yes or no to independence, and his research is looking into what else might be possible, including the free association model, the status quo, or a form of federalism.
These are the different kinds of potential solutions, and we want to estimate with the population, like what position are you kindly assume, or what you will refuse at all, or what you will be really agree to, So that's basically but it's one question, but we have many more.
The conference offered interesting perspectives and insights from the numerous experts there, but among all of those RNZ Pacific spoke to, the one consistent view was that it's still too early to tell what impacts the Trump administration will have on security and geopolitics in the Pacific region.
The head of the Catholic Church, who remains in critical condition, reportedly had a good night in hospital, the Vatican said on Monday. Pope Francis was admitted to Rome's Gemelli Hospital on February 14th after having trouble breathing for several days and was eventually diagnosed with pneumonia in both lungs. The 88-year-old, who has led the Church since 2013, has suffered bouts of ill health over the past 2 years. So, what will happen once Pope Francis dies? I put this question towards Dr. Nick Thompson, a theologian and senior lecturer from the University of Auckland.
So there's kind of three things that could happen at the moment, although I note the report today says that he's a bit better than he was yesterday. But most popes die in office. So if he dies, it's all fairly straightforward. There's a sort of procedure for confirming that he's dead, which is fairly well depicted on that recent movie Conclave, if anybody's seen it. And then there's a period of mourning of 9 days, and that includes a formal funeral somewhere between 4 or 6 days into that. And then once that's, or even actually even as that's underway, the cardinals are being called from all over the world to come to Rome, or at least the ones under 80. If they're over 80, they can't vote, but if they're under 80, they can vote. And then you have a conclave that elects the new pope, and that's usually over in a matter of days or weeks. Like hundreds of years ago, they could go on for months or years, but they've been a bit quicker in recent centuries. and they'll pick someone. It doesn't have to be another cardinal. They could pick basically any Catholic man. Unfortunately, not a woman at the moment. And that person, if they agree, gets to be the next pope. The other two kind of eventualities, one's resignation, and that hardly ever happens. But the last pope, Benedict XVI, did resign. He was the first pope in about, it was roughly 5 centuries to do that. I heard that the Pope actually wrote a resignation letter fairly early on in his time as Pope to be used if he got incapacitated, like, say he went into a coma or something like that. That's never happened in the whole history, kind of roughly 1,500 years of the papacy. And there's no rules for dealing with what happens if they become severely incapacitated but are not dead. But it would be quite possible for him at any time, as long as he's kind of conscious, to make just a sort of a formal statement saying he resigns, and then everything would kick in for the election of the next one.
Just taking a closer look at Pope Francis himself, I mean, in a way, it's kind of strange to already be talking about him as if he's already died. But I guess, all these questions arise, especially with him being in critical condition. What would you say his legacy would be, or what would Pope Francis be most remembered for?
Well, I think the most remarkable thing about him that everybody forgets is that for all of the history of the papacy, the popes have either come from the Mediterranean world, from the Middle East or North Africa, or from Europe. And, for the last, 800, 900 years, they've all been from Western Europe. He's the first one ever to come from outside Europe and to come from the Southern Hemisphere too. So he came from Argentina. And I think that's been that's been the main feature of his pontificate, is to focus on the globe. I think particularly his last two predecessors were kind of focused on European events, like the fall of the collapse of the Soviet bloc and things like that. But so Francis has focused on global issues like climate change and refugees and all of the inequities that have been created by kind of market capitalism and distortions in world trade and the poverty and the emerging economies and all of that kind of thing. He's taken a much wider focus.
We saw that he visited Papua New Guinea last year.
That's right.
Would you say he's well respected in our part of the world?
It's kind of hard to say. So, Catholicism has never been a majority religion in the South Pacific in the way it is in, say, Latin America or parts of Africa, for example, like Mozambique or Angola, where it's quite a big religion. So I think the biggest Catholic population per capita in the South Pacific is in places like Kiribati and New Caledonia, but in, say, Samoa, it's about 20% of the population, and here in Aotearoa it's more like 9%. So it doesn't have a big presence. But I do think that the fact that he came to Papua New Guinea last year was a really significant sign of where he saw, of where his priorities were. He made a big deal of Catholicism outside of Europe having to take on the features of the culture and the language where it found itself, and he really encouraged and promoted that. And he was also very concerned about the way that, as I said before, kind of global capitalism would sort of move into places in the developing world, extract all the resources, and then just leave nothing behind. And I think he wanted to signal that the church was aware of that. And yeah.
What also came to light last year was a story by the New York Times covering abuse cases involving Catholic priests who were then moved to the Pacific Islands. Yeah. What was Pope Francis's response on abuse within the church?
So it wasn't brilliant. It wasn't bad either. So I think he came into his office very conscious that Benedict XVI, his predecessor, had realised that he was not up to handling the scale of the abuse crisis. I mean, there are all kind of it's hard to pin down, but it seems that Benedict XVI realised, when he realised that he couldn't manage it, he resigned, and so he kind of left that to Francis. And at first, I think there was at least one incident in Latin America where he handled very poorly. You know, sort of didn't believe the people who were bringing charges of abuse against various clergy. I think it was in Chile. But anyway, in the longer term, I guess he kind of learned from his mistakes and from a lot of the criticism that was levelled at him, and he brought in new legislation and procedures that made it much harder for example, bishops to do what they appear to have done. That case reported by the New York Times, which was this is what they've been doing for a long time, to take abusing clergy and then just sort of quietly shunt them off somewhere else where they can, they carry on as they did before. You just kind of quietly tidy it away. I mean, obviously, the church has a whole lot more to do on that front. So I guess the most you could say is that he has made steps in the right direction, but I still think the church could have done a whole lot more.
That's Pacific Waves for today. For all episodes, head over to rnz.co.nz/Pacific. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, tō whā sui fua.